Good morning, my fellow Macedonians. I'm going to go back to one of my favorite things today because just a few questions from people. I want to talk about a Greekomani. Now, first we have to define what a Greekoman is. Now, a Greekoman is a non-ethnically Greek person, someone who doesn't speak Greek, someone who has no links with any Greeks, be they cultural, be they relationships, blood relationships. But it's someone, for some reason, at some point in time, and in our time, it's it's in the 1920s, that these people reject their own ethnicity and adopt the ethnicity of the people who actually colonized them. And in this case, it's the Greeks, the Nouveau Greeks as I like to call them. Because folks, the first Greekomani, that is the first people who weren't Greeks but adopted a Greek ethnicity, are all the Greeks who lived in Greece before 1824 when they had the revolution. So most of the fighting and the leadership, and you can Google this, was Arvaniti. That's Albanian-speaking people who went to Greece at the end of the 14th century. They were most of the fighters. The rest of the people, they call themselves Romans. Even they did not call themselves Greeks. The Arvanitis call themselves Arvaniti, the rest call themselves Romans. They call their language Romaico. So, when they divided Macedonia and after the First World War, when the borders, these current borders, were actually ratified at the Treaty of Versailles in Paris, led by Woodrow Wilson, the famous Woodrow Wilson, the so-called liberal, but he has a very dark history, but that's for another time. So when the Greeks took over, part of the conditions that they signed to at the Treaty of Versailles was to respect their minorities. Now, before that, the Greeks used to call us Bulgarians. And people, before you think that Bulgaria actually means an ethnicity, it really doesn't. During the 19th century, a Greek was someone who probably lived in the city, may have been a merchant, may have had some education, and a Bulgar was often a peasant. To denote, they did not denote ethnicity. They denote, at that point, a status within the society. So, when they divided Greece in 1913 between Serbs, Bulgars and Greeks, the Greeks, before that, the Greeks had been telling us that we're Greek, but at the same time they were telling us we're Bulgarian. So what made a Greek and what made a Bulgarian in those days was very simple. It was however the Greeks felt at that time and whoever they were speaking to at that time. So if they thought that you were able to be convinced that you were Greek, they'd call you a Greek and they'd embrace you and accept you as a great Greek. Albeit as a Greek with no Greek features, no Greek language, no Greek culture, not even a Greek appearance, you could say. So the reason they called us Bulgarians was to denigrate us. We're peasants, we're dumb, we're useless, we have no history, we're vulgars, the word vulgar in English comes from the word vulgaros, which means Bulgarian in Greek. So here we are. During that period after the Vomero Ilinden, when they send all their Greek and Bulgarian bands in there, they would come to a village and they would kill anybody who opposed them to terrorize the rest of the people into accepting what the last band had forced upon them. So, as one writer says, you could have the strange situation of, in the one day, be visited by three different bands, a Bulgarian, a Serbian, and a Greek band. And the villagers would be rounded up in the square or something, harangued in a language often that they didn't understand if it was Greek, and terrorized into becoming Greeks. So, back to the Conference of Versailles. Up till the Conference of the Versailles, most Greeks, whoever they were, as I mentioned, they didn't identify as Greek until they created the nation. Before then they were Romans or Albanians. So the Greeks used to call us Bulgarian as a form of derision. Bulgarian, a peasant, a nobody. But at the Conference of Versailles, the Bulgarians said, well, hang on a second. There are Bulgarians in Greece. Bulgarians in Greece, we want them to have their own ethnic rights. The Greeks said, no, they're not Bulgarians. They're Macedonian Slav or Macedonians. And the Greeks signed that there would be freedom of expression, freedom of language, freedom of identity. That's what they signed at the Conference of Versailles, and they broke it. Straight away in the early 20s, when Metaxas came along, they break that. Even though they had printed a book using the Greek script, they had printed a school textbook, for primary school textbook, so that Macedonians in Greece, Greek-occupied Macedonia, could be taught their own language. That's what they signed up to. But in the 20s, when they get the Metaxas, the fascists, all their signatures were meaningless. They embarked upon this purity of race nonsense, which really doesn't exist anyway. But that was the fascist, that was the Nazi thing of the day, that you belong to the one soil and the one blood. Now in the Balkans, which has been a crossroads of many civilizations, languages, ethnic groups, that is pretty nonsensical thing to say, unless of course you want to do that, so you have to oppress someone. And the people who were oppressed were the Macedonians and the Vlachs. You know, people say, oh, the Vlachs, they're Greco-Mani. Well, no, they weren't. They became Greco-Mani the very same way that our people became Greco-Mani, through terror. Initially, it was nothing else but terror. They would rock up and kill people in the village who they disagreed with the particular narrative of the people who came to terrorize the village, be they Bulgarians, Serbs or Greeks. So, there you go, my people. That's what happened to you guys in Greece. You were given the right to be Macedonians for a short time, and then it was taken away from you. And when they took that away from you, that's when the terror began in earnest within Greece. That's when we hear about children being beaten, their tongues being pierced, people being killed for denying the fact that they were... Well, it was an attempted physical genocide. That didn't work. So after the war, they attempted a cultural and linguistic genocide, an identity genocide. And for a long time there, it seemed to be working. But the existence of Greek Macedonians proves the very stupidity of that notion that there is a Greece, there are Greeks. Because the first Greeks were the Arvaniti, then the Romans, and the next were the Vlachs and Macedonians. Now, how can four different linguistic groups all belong to the same nation? How can four different cultures all belong to the same nation? That's why, after the war, after the failed national liberation struggle by our partisans, after the war, the word Macedonia was forbidden. You could not say Macedonian under any circumstances. Even in their maps, even in the school textbooks, Macedonia was referred to as the new territories. New occupied territories was the reality. So, if you're a Greek Macedonian today, if you call yourself Greek Macedonian, and you don't have a Greek parent, or you don't have a Macedonian parent, I don't know what you're talking about. If you say you're a Macedonian, but are citizens of Greece, that's fair enough, because we're Macedonians and we're citizens of Australia. That's fair enough. Citizenship does not mean ethnicity. That's what you've got to get through your head. So Straight after the Second World War, the Greeks tried very hard to erase the very idea that there is such a thing in Macedonia. Everybody became Greek. And last time I was in Macedonia, in Ege, I ran into many people of my age and younger. When I asked them, what are you? Unlike the 70s and 60s and even 80s, when they'd say Greek, and wonder why you're asking them such a stupid question. Now they all said Macedonia. There's a seismic shift in the consciousness of our people in Ege, from being too afraid to say the Macedonian to being proud to be Macedonian. So my next question was, why don't you speak Macedonian? Now the reason they didn't speak Macedonian was the terror had left such an impression on the people growing up then, not on the kids but on their parents, so they were too afraid to teach their kids their own language in case those kids were to speak it, and that would reflect badly on the family. They would most likely be oppressed, who knows, beaten up. That's in reality what happened to the generation, say, who were born in the 20s and 30s and 40s, those that grew up there. But now I want to talk to the people who were born here of Greco-Romani parents. And, you know, like, I don't know how many there are in Melbourne, but I know in Shepparton, half the people were born in Australia, or little kids when they came here, didn't speak Greek, had no connections with Greece whatsoever, but would insist on being Greek. They would not say they're Macedonian, they would insist on being Greek. Now, this led to some very, very funny situations, folks. Like, for example, Italians in Shepparton saying stuff like "Kako si be, Jimmy Maker," and telling me that they're speaking in Greek. That's how ridiculous it was. Now, those of you who still maintain that you're Greek, and I know, actually, there's been an awakening even in my little community in Shepparton. The people of my age, the people who did not experience the terror, they're questioning their very existence now. They're asking people like me, why are we Greek? What are we really? But deep down, they all know we're Macedonian, because that's the language that they first heard when they were born. That's the language that they spoke to in their parents and grandparents. So, guys, if you're Greek Macedonian, I understand what your parents have gone through and grandparents went through, but those of you here in Australia, you didn't go through that. You were conned into that. You weren't forced into it, you were conned into that. And in Australia, part of that con was based on the idea that Greek civilization is somehow superior to Macedonian civilization. When in fact, if you look at who the most famous ancient people from Europe are, pre-Christian people in Europe, I'd like you to think yourself, who can you think of that's considered Greek? The most famous Greeks of ancient times. Was it Socrates? Was it Plato? Was it Pericles? No. The most famous ancient Greeks were in fact Macedonians. So the Greeks not only do they believe that the descendant of the ancient Hellenes, which is a nonsense. Most ancient Hellenes were killed or died through plagues. But they also believe that the ancient Macedonians were Greek, something that the ancient Greeks did not believe. So if you, growing up here, want to accept that you're Greek, then you must reject being Macedonian, because you can't be both. You can be a Greek citizen, but you can't be ethnically Greek and ethnically Macedonian. That's a ridiculous statement, because you know yourself, none of your parents spoke to you in Greek. Why didn't they speak to you in Greek if you were Greeks? I don't understand that. They tell you they're Greeks, but they wouldn't say "Είμαστε Helleni," they would say "Ние сме Гръци." Unfortunately, most of our people there, through the terror, accepted that nonsense. And I understand them, because, you know, terror is physical violence, it's death. But here, I don't understand what the Macedonian wannabe Greeks. I don't understand that, because I've just pointed out to you the most famous ancient Europeans were Alexander and Cleopatra, not Pericles and Socrates. So, the Greeks were very smart in that they realized the glory of the Macedonians because of the Alexander conquest are much more important than any of the Greek philosophers and Greek mathematicians and all that. Because the Greek mathematicians and Greek philosophers, they went to school in Egypt and Babylon and so on. That's where they get their knowledge. But the ancient Macedonians created their glory through conquest. Now, some of you want to be both Greek and Macedonian, and in fact, that's what a lot of Greeks want now. In fact, these new Greeks, these wannabe Greeks, they don't just want to be Greek, they want to be Macedonian. They also claim the glory of Rome. And I don't know how they can do that. There's a big difference between Greek and Macedonian, and a big difference between Greek and Italian, or Latin speaking. But, folks, it's very simple. Greek colonized 51% of Macedonia. The border that exists now, the border that separates Dragos from Bitusha, Dragos from Opsirina, Dragos from Sveta Petka, Nagochani from Lajec, that border, and I know that well because that's where I'm from, that border has never existed before in the history of the world. So how can it be an ethno-divisive border? It can't. Getting back to what I was saying about the children growing up here. The children growing up here, you've been conned by this idea that being Greek somehow makes you special. You've been conned by this idea that being Greek makes you better than being a Macedonian, when in fact the whole modern Greek narrative is based on Macedonia. Now, I could go on and on, but after 10 minutes I think most people switch off. So folks, all of you, all those friends of mine in Shepparton, the ones that still haven't woken up, what are you waiting for? What sort of alarm bell do you need? Don't you realize that you're called vulgari? Or if you personally aren't called vulgari, your brother, your sister, your cousin, whatever, who declares to be Macedonian is called the vulgaris. So don't you get it? If your relatives are something that the Greeks call Bulgarian, what does that make you? I'll tell you what it makes you. It makes you very confused. It makes you looking for reason when there is no reason. That's why you all go, we're Greek Macedonian. You're halfway there, folks. Now, come back into the fold. We love you. You know why we love you? We love you because you're our cousins, our uncles, our aunts. You're our family. We speak the same language. We practice the same customs. That's why we love you. If the Greeks loved you, they would let you be what you are. The Greeks don't love you. The Greeks hate you. That's why they try to change you into being a facsimile of who they are. And the irony is, as I've tried to point it out, is that there is no such thing as a modern Greek. They're all wannabe Greeks. They're all Albanians, Vlachs, who knows what else went through that part of the world. Now, I want to say anybody out there who is a Greco-man, who has an issue with what I've just said, please come to the coffee club, because you are literally lost in a delusion forced upon your parents through the point of gun and forced upon you through a feeling of inferiority to the Greeks. Yet when I look around, I don't see any inferiority towards modern Greece. In fact, I don't see any inferiority of the Macedonian people towards anyone. Per head of population, I believe we punch about our weight, not just in sport and music and such, but intellectually. However, in Australia now, a lot of our intellectuals who came out here from Ege, they have Greek names. They have Greek names, therefore when somebody sees someone in the newspaper who's achieved something with a Greek name, they think they're Greek. No, they're not. They're Macedonians. I don't want to name any names because that's not about names, it's not about individuals, it's about the process, it's about the brutal process of colonization that instills fear and self-loathing in otherwise normal, wonderful people. And we Macedonians have as great a history as anyone in Europe. Be proud of that. Don't have to have a qualifier, Greek Macedonian, because that's an oxymoron. That's like saying I'm a black white guy. Or I'm a white black guy. Thanks very much, folks. Come to the coffee club and tell me why you think you're Greek.
Thank you.